All right, looks like we are live, I think. Uh, Welcome everybody to another AMA. I'm Steve White, founder and CEO of RentPrep. Um, and thank you everybody who is joining maybe along the way or joining in right away. Uh, as always, thank you to Ashley for orchestrating and producing all this stuff behind the scenes, and to everybody who participates and sends in questions either ahead of time or live. Always happy to answer or try my best to answer these questions as best as I can. If I don't know an answer, I'm usually going to tell you I don't know an answer to that, or look up in your state to see specifically, or try to give you enough breadcrumbs or lead you in the right direction to at least find an answer. Because a lot of times the questions that I'm getting are state specific, and if even if I do know your state, there's a good chance that I may not know the answer if it's based on a state specific nuance. So I'll definitely let you know if we're potentially dealing with a state specific issue and I can't point you in the right direction. Otherwise, I'm always trying my best to help the landlords out and give you guys as much good information as I can. So just want to double check real quick, make sure that my audio is good. So I'm just going to wait for the thumbs up from Ashley just to be sure before I jump in. And looks like we got a couple of questions preloaded from maybe overnight. So I'll get to those first and then jump into anything live. So feel free to post a question in the comments, and I'll do my best to get to them and try to give you the best answer. And they can range from just about anything. I got the thumbs up from Ashley, so we are good with the audio. So we'll jump in. Okay, so looks like we had a couple of questions come in. I'll start with first one from Kelly. So Kelly says, let me just drag this over here. Okay. So Kelly says she's experienced nuances in screening that she'd like to get my opinion on. I have had several instances where an applicant has had a credit ding or a bankruptcy while trying to do the right thing. For example, rescue a granddaughter from a drug-dependent parent. The rest of the screening looks good. I have other qualified candidates to compare them with that also have good screening data. Would you always choose those with cleaner credit, or would you take the right thing experiences into account? This is a tough one because screening's near and dear to me, obviously, and it's tough because screening is not always super black and white. Matter of fact, I always say the right screening formula is 2 parts data, 1 part gut feeling. You have to have a good combination, a good mixture of both. If you're relying too heavily on one or the other, you know, there's a chance to make a mistake there. And obviously we've talked to a lot of landlords over the years who go solely off of their gut. And man, there is nothing more disappointing when your gut fails you. And especially if you had an opportunity to, you know, to take an extra step and to make sure that that doesn't happen. So good combination of both. You want to look at the data, you want to trust your gut, and like I always say, a good screening report is the best conversation starter. So, you know, if you see something on there like a credit ding, or like Kelly mentions, a bankruptcy, it's never a bad idea to say, hey, tell me a little bit about this, or what happened. In terms of somebody doing the right thing, you're going to have to trust your gut there as to whether or not they're being honest or telling you the truth, because obviously people usually have a really good reason for, you know, what went wrong or what happened. I don't know if many people are going to be forthcoming and say, hey, I made a really dumb decision, or I had a bad stretch here, and I just didn't make great decisions, or you know, I got fired from my job, and so things were tough. They're usually going to try to sugarcoat it a little bit and say, you know, I I lost my job. It was out of my control. Then my finances started to slip, and so be careful. Not to say that you should never trust anybody, but just be careful that you're not completely buying into um, you know what the reasoning is. You definitely have to weigh it out and see if it makes sense or not, and then also consider, is it something that's going to continue to happen? So if you have a grandmother who obviously cares enough to take care of her granddaughter, chances are she's probably not going to leave her hanging in the future if something should come up. So does that impact your ability or her ability to pay rent into the future if she does the right thing a lot? And again, not that you want to penalize somebody for doing the right thing, but you got to have good judgment in these types of situations. So I would say, really, you have to look at it. You have to look at it from the bigger picture. Is, can they absorb that you know uh, that credit ding or that bankruptcy? Although a credit ding and a bankruptcy are a world apart from each other. So that's if somebody filed a bankruptcy because they were trying to do the right thing, I would say there's usually a lot more into a bankruptcy than just helping your granddaughter out one time or whatever. So again, it's a good conversation starter to say, how did it happen? What happened? And sometimes bankruptcies aren't a terrible thing for a renter. It really just depends on when it was filed. If you're dealing with a renter who's in the middle of filing and it still hasn't been discharged yet, that's a potential concern, because it may not be discharged. It could be dismissed, and they could also add you as a creditor on the bankruptcy, which is a nightmare for a landlord. So you want to be careful with that. But if they filed bankruptcy, a few years ago, especially if it's a Chapter 7, that they're not going to have any credit for 7 years beyond that. And a lot of times that frees them up to be able to prioritize their commitments, their financial commitments, and make sure that the rent is paid. They're not, your rent payment's not competing with a bunch of really high interest credit cards and things like that. So bankruptcies aren't always a horrible thing. I think what you're looking for specifically there is how recently did they file, and how often have they filed over a 10-year period? Because bankruptcy is supposed to be your mulligan, your one chance to do things over. You made some mistakes, or maybe something happened that was out of your control, and you get to press the reset. But if you're filing twice in a 10-year period, that's more of a character issue there, of maybe this is part of your financial strategy to rack up debts, file bankruptcy. So you want to be aware of how frequent they're filing that bankruptcy in that 10-year period. And that's why when we do screening, bankruptcies are reportable for 10 years. They're one of the only pieces of adverse information that have that long of a reporting period, because you want to check for, again, repeat filings after they can file every 7 years. So I would say it's okay to consider, exceptions, especially if somebody's got something on their report that maybe puts them into a gray area, or doesn't make them qualify so easily. You just want to make sure that you're not going outside of your screening criteria so completely and obviously that now it might look like discrimination to somebody. So you want to definitely make sure that you have your screening criteria figured out ahead of time and set. And I do see here that Shane followed up with a question on this, where he says, tell us your screening criteria. I'm not sure if he meant Kelly, as in Kelly, can you tell us your screening criteria? But I think Shane's probably trying to get at the same thing that I'm getting at here is if you have your criteria set and they don't meet your criteria and someone else does, you know, again, you want to be sure that you're not discriminating because it works both ways. It's you know, you got to be careful on each side of that spectrum. And you want to make sure that you're making consistent decisions. So, you know, it's never a bad idea to set your screening criteria kind of high, and that way it does allow for maybe a little wiggle room for exceptions if you want, or set a good range. So in this case, if it were to say like, you know, you can't have any active collection accounts, and you know the good-natured grandmother here has an active collection account and it's a legitimate reason, it's due to her trying to help out her granddaughter, the next thing you want to follow that up with is, does that collection account impact her ability to pay the rent? Because you know the last thing that you want to do as a landlord is you know, take on someone else's issues and problems. That grandmother's going to have issues and problems, you know, taking care of her granddaughter and trying to get the mother to pitch in and do the right thing. So you don't want any part of that either. So I would say as long as your flexibility and your willingness to work with someone doesn't take you so far outside of your screening criteria that it's no longer a good, you know, a good fit or an easy decision, then, you know, it's okay to use a little bit of judgment. It's okay to go with your gut feeling, as long as it's supported by good data and backed up by good data as well. So, yeah, that's tough. You really want to take it case by case in that situation. So, and I would say again, you know, you want to make sure that you're not putting yourself at a disadvantage. Obviously, everybody wants to do the right thing, but if that's going to cost you in the long run, then you know, you as the landlord, you might have to make a difficult decision there and go with the more obviously qualified applicants, even though your heart's bleeding for that grandmother that tried to do the right thing. So I get it. Okay. Moving on to a question here from Dolores. Dolores is asking, what is the best way to limit overnight guests, especially in a resort area? What are reasonable number of days per month or consecutive days, etc.? And how do you state this in a lease? How do you monitor for it? And can you charge for it? And if so, how much? So, okay, so we'll start with best way to limit overnight guests. And I would say the best way to do that is to make sure that you have the right language in your lease agreement, and make sure that you're going over it with them, as with everything in the lease agreement. And this is a really good example of why it pays off to take the time to go over someone's lease agreement, is because you want to let them know, first off, you want to get their acknowledgement that they understand what they're agreeing to, but also you want to let them know that there's certain things that you're going to be keeping an eye out for, and so there's less, maybe hopefully less incentive for them to do something and think they're going to get away with it, or have the mindset of, well, I'd rather ask for forgiveness than for permission. So, you know, especially when you're going over long-term guests, what defines a long-term guest, you want to make mention of things like, you know, there's limited parking, or, you know, we're going to see a higher frequency of people coming in and out, or anything like that. You want to sort of identify what those triggers are, so that they know you're aware, and it makes them a little bit less, you know, likely to try to just get away with it. So I would say now again, you're in a resort area, so some of this may not apply, but I would think if this is a long-term rental and we're not talking short-term rental, I would think that typical or normal, you know, language in a lease would apply to it. So, normally you're going to put it in the lease and mention something around, whether it's 2 or 3 nights that somebody can stay or 7 days that somebody can stay until they're considered an occupant, and not an overnight guest. So you definitely want to put a limit to it. If you're in a resort area, I could see that maybe changing the limit a little bit. Maybe they've got family coming in and family's going to stay with them for a week. And then at that point, it's really up to you on what you consider to be excessive or beyond reason. So if it's a parking issue and somebody staying there for a week overnight would become an issue, then you want to make sure you put that in your lease agreement. If you've already got a lease agreement with somebody, you can obviously add an addendum to it that you can ask them to sign or present a new lease when it comes time to renew. But you got to make sure that it's in your lease agreement. You want to be able to point back to something and say, look, we both agreed on this, you sell. So that's first and foremost. Number of days, consecutive days, again, it's all up to you, but those are you're using the right words. So in your lease agreement, you want to say things like, consecutive nights that a guest can stay. Consecutive days that, a guest who stays, who can stay, will need to get written permission from the landlord if it's beyond X amount of days or whatever that you choose for it to be. If you're trying to stay competitive in a resort area, it may not be a bad idea to find out what the neighbors are doing or find out what others are doing as well, if that's a concern. If not, and you just have a hardline position on it and it is what it is, then just make sure that you put it in your lease agreement. And then when it comes time to enforce it, which is your question on how do you monitor it, well, the good old-fashioned way of monitoring it usually, which is it usually comes out in a complaint. You got a neighbor saying, hey, somebody's taking my parking spot, or maybe you're doing an inspection, you're going into the property and you notice that that there's more people there that should be, or again, maybe they're taking up more parking spaces. So it's like anything else. I mean, there's no way to automate monitoring it other than checking in, listening to complaints, and following up with them that way. And then in terms of charging, again, if you put it in the lease, you can do it. I can't say that I've ever seen a situation where somebody charges for an additional or what we would consider a long-term guest versus. So, again, if you're in a resort area and maybe it's structured different and maybe you can charge by the guest, then that's something you want to consider. Again, as long as it's in the lease, I wouldn't consider it to be out of bounds if you put something in there that said, after 3 consecutive nights, there'll be an additional charge, of X amount per day, as a hosting fee or something like that. Outside of a resort area, I would say that's pretty uncommon. So typically what happens is if they stay past a certain point, then you have to consider whether or not they're going to be treated as an occupant. And you also have to be careful because in some states, if you stay at a certain place and you're living there long enough, you're considered an occupant, whether the landlord likes it or not. And that's where you run into some issues with squatters and squatters' rights and things like that. So, I would say, again, being that you're in a resort area, charging for it seems plausible, more likely than if it wasn't in a resort area. Otherwise, I feel like it's got to be a decision point at that juncture, whether you're enforcing the lease and you're saying, hey, listen, you're in violation of the lease agreement, or you say, hey, this is an occupant, this is your long-term boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever the case might be, And in order for an occupant to be here, they've got to be screened. They've got to go through the same process. And then at that point, you want to make sure that you're getting them on the lease agreement. You're going through a screen, make sure you know who's living there. Uh, but that's for sure up to you. Again, these are all things that you got to think of at the time that you're creating the lease and having them sign the lease, because it's really hard to go back uh, and make changes after a lease is already in place. And it's not always easy to get somebody to sign an addendum to a lease, uh, because at that point it's just kind of at their own will. So again, definitely worth taking the time, put some thought into it, make sure that you structure it out, make sure that you write everything in that lease that you want them to adhere to and be compliant to, and then take the time to actually go through the lease with them so they understand as well. So I hope that answers your question, Dolores. I would say, sounds to me like in the resort area might give you a little bit different circumstance, and you might be able to treat that a little bit differently. All right, so we got a next question from Shane. Shane says he's taking on a new property with tenants. He's going to be passing on rent increases. What's the best way to break the news? They're both month to month, and we have no restrictions on how much rent can increase. I assume he means in his state, there's no restrictions on how much rent you can, or how much you can increase the rent by. So, a couple of thoughts here. I would take the time to first determine if these are good tenants or not, and good long-term tenants that you want to keep. And if they are, you may want to stretch out an increase a little bit if you can, because as any good landlord will tell you, a long-term tenant can be pretty valuable and can add a lot of value. So if it comes down to the decision between collecting an extra $50 a month and losing these potentially good long-term tenants, or stretching that out maybe over a little bit of time and keeping them and not having to incur those additional fees of turnover, finding a new tenant, potentially a month or two of vacancy. To me, there's a lot of value in that long-term tenant. So that's first and foremost. Make sure you know what you're dealing with there and who you're dealing with. Now, if they've been there for 10 years and they're pretty good tenants, however, they're way under the market rent because you had a soft landlord who didn't continue to raise the rents and keep up with the market pace, now you got a little bit of a different problem on your hand. And I would say that's somewhat common that we see landlords get into, where it's tough to deal with that situation because it's a long-term tenant. Everybody wants a great tenant that's going to be there for 10 years, or at least most landlords that I talk to. And so, it's a delicate balance. So I would at least consider stretching out the length of time that you're going to increase that rent. Because if they're both, and Shane mentions they're both on a month to month, most states, you really only need to give a 30-day notice if they're on a month to month. If you're like, for example, in California, you'd have to give a 60-day notice if they've lived there for more than 1 year. So if they're a long-term tenant, they've been there for a number of years, you may have to give them more than just the 30-day notice, even if they're on month to month. But in most cases, it's going to be a 30-day notice. But again, that's a really quick way to ruin a relationship if you're trying to salvage a relationship potentially with a good long-term tenant. So, if you hit them with a rent increase immediately, that could definitely turn them off. They leave, and you don't always know what you're going to get next. So, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? If you got a great long-term tenant already there, consider what that's potentially worth. and just make sure you're taking that into consideration and not just increasing the rent. If you're patient, the rent will increase over time. And if they're a really good long-term tenant, it'll be a little bit easier for them to absorb that. Me personally, I would rather take that approach versus, hitting them with it right away. Now, if they're not very good tenants, or maybe they haven't been there a long time and you don't know yet, or it's unknown, then, I'd give the proper notice, 30 or 60 days, depending on your state. And maybe it's worth having a conversation with them as well and saying, hey, we got to get you caught up here to where the market rate is, and it's going to go up, after this date, and they're either going to stay and pay or leave, and you're going to get somebody else who's willing to pay that amount. So just at least give some extra consideration to if their tenant's worth keeping or not. So I hope that answers your question. All right. So I got another question here from Linda. Linda's asking, what are your thoughts on including appliances in a rental? Any advice on what to put in lease if I include appliances? So it's funny, I just ran into a situation not long ago, maybe a month ago, maybe a tad bit more, where I had a dishwasher die in one of my rental units, and of course they moved in with the dishwasher. It's my responsibility to fix or replace if something goes wrong, because they should be renting in the same condition that it was rented out to them in. You don't always need to include appliances in the lease. And in my case, I'm pretty sure I did not, but it's it's what you provided when they entered into the agreement, and so it's assumed that that you're going to have to provide that through the length of the lease agreement. So that's the one thing you want to be careful about, is that if you're offering appliances, you're going to be the one on the hook to repair and replace if and when that time comes, unless you have something specifically in your lease that says, hey, we're going to give you the dishwasher, or part of your lease agreement. If the dishwasher breaks, it's up to you to fix it. You can certainly put that into a lease agreement. And it's up to the potential tenant or renter if they're going to actually agree to that or not want to agree to it. But I would say more often than not, the landlord is taking care of the appliances if they were given to the person. And the obvious benefit to including appliances is that it makes the rental a lot more attractive. Usually, if somebody's moving in and they don't have a washer and dryer, or they don't have a fridge or dishwasher, especially if it's something that's built in, you're definitely going to attract them with having it there. And if it is something built in, you want to make sure too that they're not swapping it out or changing it without your knowledge, or certainly leaving when their lease is up and taking the appliances with you. So at the very least, you want to have an inventory of what you have in there, the condition that it's in. So I would say, for me personally, in the past year, I've had a bad washing machine and a bad dishwasher that I've had to replace both items, which, I could complain, because obviously, that chews into cash flow on that property. But I've also gone, plenty of years where nothing, knock on wood, where nothing has broken down, and I've made out pretty well. So, I think it ends up tending to balance out, and it's really a question of whether or not you're willing to deal with replacing and repairing, or if you just want to strip everything out and tell them it's up to you. But again, you might be limiting who's gonna want the property, or who's gonna want to move in there. So you got to take that into consideration. I would say for every landlord, it's a little bit different. Okay. Next question here I've got from Allie. So Allie wants to know, she says, we're going to be renovating part of the kitchen in our rental. There's a tenant that currently lives there. Do I need to pay for a hotel room or some form of housing while the kitchen is being worked on? They are calling for 2 days of work. I would say I'm pretty surprised that they wouldn't be able to live in the property while it's being worked on, like at the same time. But then again, if you're renovating a kitchen in 2 days, maybe that does make sense. Maybe they're, you know, putting drapes up and just getting to work in there and gonna, you know, work 2 days straight and get this thing done. I would say it's not crazy to assume that you have to put your tenant up if you're the one that is telling them, hey, you can't be here. It's one thing if you're doing the work and it's like one of those pardon my dust signs, you know, like, hey, yeah, it's going to be inconvenient, but you can live around it. And sorry, it's going to have, you know, there's going to be some renovation over the next couple of days or couple of weeks, but you know, and it might be inconveniencing you, but you could still live here at least. If you're telling them, hey, you have to leave and you have to get out for 2 days, I feel like you're on the hook there, and it's up to you to make sure that you're providing housing for them for those 2 days, or some sort of you know, compensation on the rent or offset on the rent. So, you know, I think a couple of ways that you can look at that is either you set it up for them or you tell them, hey, show me your invoice, I'll compensate for you. A little bit of danger in doing that is they head down to the Four Seasons and, you know, it's costing you $500 a night for them to stay nice and cozy, and that's obviously not going to go over well. So I would say if it was me, I'd want a little bit of control over it and say, hey, I got you a place down here at the local hotel to live for a few days. Sorry for the inconvenience. You know, I don't think that's crazy. So that's an interesting one. I would like to see what other landlords would say in the community. So Allie, that one might be worth posting in the community and kind of crowdsource what some other landlords are doing in that situation. I'd be real curious to find out if other landlords are picking the hotels, paying for the people to stay, doing some sort of rent offset, or giving them maybe like some sort of a, you know, per diem, and controlling the cost that way. But I would definitely be interested what other landlords are doing there as well. All right. Question from Tommy on the next one here. So Tommy asks, what is the best way to find short-term tenants? Have you had any experiences with VRBO or Airbnb? I would say no, I don't personally have any experience with VRBO or Airbnb, although I have used both of them. For some reason I prefer Airbnb. I don't know if I have a specific reason other than that's just the one that I typically end up using if I'm traveling out of state, or you know, if I've got employees traveling to a conference, and nowadays it's a heck of a lot cheaper to, you know, rent out a 3-bedroom condo versus booking 3 separate hotel rooms for employees. So, you know, definitely familiar with Airbnb, VRBO. And I've heard landlords, you know, there's a love-hate relationship with it. I would say the insight or the advice that I can give you, Tommy, is look into some other potential short-term tenants and where they might come from. And I'll give you a really good example would be traveling nurses. So, you know, I've talked to a lot of landlords over the years who have found this niche in traveling nurses or any kind of corporate short-term rental deals, and man, they pay awesome from what I've heard. Um, they're they're great arrangements to get yourself into, especially if you're in an area where you've got a company that's going to use you and keep you booked and keep your unit rented. Um, that could definitely be, you know, a good potential option for you. So I would consider outside of Airbnb, VRBO, any of those things. If you can, obviously you're going to keep a little bit more money in your pocket if you can create a partnership with a local company or a local, you know, staffing company, nursing company, um, that they're going to you for rentals or to place somebody or to, you know, to house an executive while he's in town for a few months or something like that. So I would say definitely definitely get creative, call call companies in your area, see if you can partner with some of them or get on a list. And then obviously the VRBO and Airbnb route, you can always go that route as well. But that, you know, you're basically playing by their rules. You're getting their reviews. That stuff is very searchable. So that's all. Those are all things that you've got to consider as well. All right. Hope that at least helps you, Tommy. So check out traveling nurses and in corporate rentals. All right. So next one, we've got a question here from Catherine. How do I give proper notice of a non-renewal? Um, so non-renewal notice is typically in writing. I'm pretty sure that we've got free templates free to use at rentprep.com. If you go there and search renewal notices or non-renewal notices, you should be able to find a template in there to be able to, you know, to use and to make sure that you're giving proper written notice. Always, and I would always make this a written notice thing. I know in some states they allow for, you know, some verbal notice to be given. Um, in some circumstances, I would never trust that. I'd put it in writing. You know, if you're typically communicating with them through text or email, um, you could send it to, you know, to them, or at least say, hey, did you get my letter? Send the letter out, put it in writing. And then when it comes to the time frame and how long you have to wait, kind of going back to the earlier question, typically it's a 30-day notice. In some states like California, uh, if they've lived over a year, then it's a 60-day notice that you've got to give. So just make sure that whatever state that you're in, you're you're in the proper time frame, whether it's 30 or 60 days, and that's usually dependent on how long that they've been a tenant. Um, and again, it depends on the circumstances too. You know, if they're not a great tenant and you just want to be done with them and move on, um, you know, you want to make sure you're giving them enough notice, but not giving so much notice that it gives them extra time to seethe about it if it's going to be a contentious breakup. So, you know, definitely make sure that you're doing everything, checking all the boxes, putting it in writing, um, and then following through with them as well. You know, making sure that you're keeping up, you know, with what's happening, what's going on, uh, and not just sort of leaving it out there, hoping that they leave on the day that they're supposed to. Some people might dig their heels in and say no. All right, hope that helps answer your question, Catherine. So use a non-renewal notice. Question from George. George asks, what's your advice for dealing with a prospective tenant that has federal liens on their report? Let me see here. It looks like he's got a follow-up to that. Follow-up would be, we leased it to one individual, and our lease agreement specifically states that only that individual may live in the unit. We have a suspicion, maybe someone else living there, or should best be approve it. Thanks. I'm not sure if that follow-up is related to George's question or not, but oh, Ashley says no follow-up. Thanks, Ashley. All right, so I'll answer George's question directly. Advice for dealing with a prospective tenant that has federal liens on their report. Keep this in mind. There are very few exceptions to who is exempt from a bankruptcy, and I'll give you a hint. It is always the government. So student loans, which are usually backed by the government, liens, tax liens, those are also things you cannot file bank or include in your bankruptcy. So my point is, nobody's going to run and get away from a federal lien, federal tax lien, I'm assuming you're talking about. So that's something that you've got to consider. They're going to pay someday, sooner or later, and it might be in the form of a garnishment. It may be in the form of a tax refund garnishment or a wage garnishment. But at some point, they're going to pay. And when they do pay, it's going to have some sort of impact on their income. Whether or not that affects their rent to income ratio, I think is really what you want to be looking at. So if it's a pretty substantial federal lien, it's definitely worth asking them, what's your plan to repay this? And they may tell you that they already have a payment plan, and then make sure that that payment plan was at least disclosed when you're considering what their income is versus what their debt or what the rent ratio that you want it to be. That's not going to be something that shows up on someone's credit report, and it may show up, like if RentPrep is doing a judgment and lien search, it may show up, but it's going to give you the whole amount that they owed. It's going to give you a updated file amount, so if they're paying it down, but it's not going to tell you what their payment plan looks like. So that you've got to ask them what their payment plan is. If they don't have one, that means it's coming around the corner. Again, that you can only avoid that stuff for so long until it's time to pay, and the government is for sure going to get their money one way or another. So you've got to take into consideration if it's going to impact their ability to pay rent, and if it's ratio enough that it puts them outside of your screening criteria. So most landlords, set for their screening criteria that they want a 3-to-1 rent to income ratio, and if after you consider what that payment plan is going to be, do they still fall within that ratio, or now are they outside of that ratio? In terms of judging it and saying, like, is it a big deal? Is it not a big deal? I don't know if it's something that I would consider as necessarily, it's not as concerning as a violent crime, or somebody who's a sex offender or something like that. It's potentially concerning, and I would want to know how did this happen, or what was the basis for it. And if it's let's say a franchise tax, for example, that's something that we see fairly often. It's somewhat common. Usually it's a sign that the business went under. They bought a Subway. It was their dream to make subs. I don't know, whatever the reason is. And the business didn't go well, and they stopped paying the franchise tax on it, trying to, stay operational and to keep things moving. And eventually it just caught up to them. So it could be something like that, where they're trying to get over a past. But again, I don't think that necessarily takes away also from whether or not that impacts their ability to pay rent. So kind of two parts to that. Does it affect their impact to pay the rent? And What was the reasoning behind it, and is that something that you need to be concerned about too? You know, if they were for a long time and you're found to have not, you know, been approved or should not have been collecting unemployment, and you can't pay it all back as well. Again, the government is going to want to get their money back. And so it's always worth asking what happened, tell me the circumstances, and then, you know, judge it that way as well. All right, so next one, we got a question from Mary. Mary says, we leased our apartment to one individual, and our lease agreement specifically states that only that of an individual may live in the unit. We have suspicion that there may be someone else living there as well, but we aren't sure the best way to prove it. Any advice? I would say this. What you want to avoid, Mary, is the temptation to catch them in the act. I know that's every landlord's, you know, I don't want to say dream, but, you know, every landlord wants to catch somebody who's been lying to them and say, oh, there's no way that you can, you know, argue that this wasn't happening. I'll give you a good example is I had a friend who had a very clear no smoking policy, and, you know, his rental unit smelled like smoke and cigarettes, and he knew the guy was smoking in there. And the one day he caught him red-handed, couldn't dispute it, caught him smoking in the unit. In this case, I mean, it's not like you're gonna, you know, stake out the house or something. You want to be careful about dropping in unannounced. So I would say, you know, it's worth having a conversation and saying, hey, remember the lease agreement that you signed, and just asking them directly, is there anyone else living here? If they are, we want to make sure that they're being either listed as an occupant, or what you alluded to here, if the agreement specifically states that only one individual may live in the unit, then you just want to, again, reiterate and reinforce to them, hey, we can only have one person living here. And if there's a legitimate or good reason why, beyond because I said so, I would share that with them as well. And give them an opportunity to come clean on it. You can always do the inspections, which, if you've listened to any of my AMAs in the past, you know that I'm a huge fan of. You definitely want to go back into, you know, your rental units, at least check for plumbing leaks, change light bulbs, whatever reason that you need to go in there. But just at least be able to take a look around. So that might be something else. If they know that, if somebody knows that you're going to be checking in, or there's a process in place, hopefully that deters them at least enough to want to. And obviously, if you find out that, you know, that they're in violation of the lease agreement, then you want to make sure that you're notifying them and letting them know, hey, you know, you've got X amount of days to basically comply or quit. You know, you're going to be in violation of your lease agreement, and that would be terms for an eviction, or at the very least a non-renewal, depending on how their lease agreement is structured. So, but I would start with having a conversation, having an upfront conversation, and just asking them directly, is this, do you have somebody living here? So hope that helps out, Mary. Okay, so next question I got here is from Susan. Susan says, I drove by my rental property today. It looks like my tenant put a trampoline in the backyard. Could I be held liable if someone is injured? Do I need to add this to the lease? 100% yes, and yes. Some landlords even go as far as to say no trampolines, no different than some landlords say no pools. You know, you can't put a above ground pool, or even what they would consider to be like a temporary, non-permanent, inflatable, whatever. But if it's a certain depth, then it could be a potential issue. Yeah, I would definitely say, you know, I would definitely add it to the lease. At the very least, I would make sure, if you don't already, um, make them carry some sort of renter's insurance. Make sure that the trampoline's on the renter's insurance. You just want to protect yourself, obviously, but I just talked to a landlord maybe a week or two ago that had somebody trip on a sidewalk out, going up or from the house to the driveway. So it was on their property. Somebody tripped on a sidewalk, and he got a letter from an attorney. So if it happens on your property, yeah, I mean, you could absolutely be putting yourself at liability, and at least some sort of insurance liability there for sure. If they've got the neighborhood kids coming over, jumping on the trampoline, a friend, a family member, whoever. So yeah, I would either say no trampoline, or um, make sure that it's covered under the renter's insurance at the very least. Otherwise, you know, what are you going to do? You're going to have stand outside in your backyard and make people sign waivers before they use the trampoline to make sure that you don't get sued for it. So yeah, I would definitely say. And another issue that I just talked to a landlord about recently too, reminds me with the trampoline, is we had a windstorm in our area a couple of months ago. They had a trampoline in the backyard. Trampoline picked up like a sail and flew into a fence and smashed a chunk of the fence out. And the insurance company would not cover it and gave them a real hard time about, was the trampoline properly secured to the ground? Can you show us the original instructions that dictate how it should be properly secured? Can you show us the mechanisms that you use to properly secure it? That whole thing. Keep in mind, insurance companies, their job is to find reasons not to pay out on claims. So they're going to find as many as they can. So, I would see a trampoline in the backyard as a liability, probably in more ways. I would look to remedy that with either renter's insurance, or you can't have a trampoline. All right. Hope that helps answer your question, Susan. Sorry to be the fun police for your tenants there. I know trampolines are fun for kids, but not for landlords. Question from Bill. How long can a tenant stay after the lease expires? We're not looking to renew the lease. So I think what you're asking there, Bill, is after the lease expires, what's going to happen to that tenant? If it's not already in your lease agreement, it's usually assumed that it's going to roll over into a month-to-month lease agreement unless you give them a notice for non-renewal. So that's really a decision that you've got to make. If if the lease expiration date is 90 days out, you've got to think of that and work within the time frames by your state. So it's either 30 days or 60 days that you need to give proper notice. So give them that non-renewal notice to let them know, hey, we're not going to renew your lease. And as of if you're not looking for them to leave necessarily, and you just don't want to renew the lease, and you're okay with them being there in a month-to-month lease agreement, then it should automatically just roll over into a month-to-month lease agreement. It should state that in your original lease agreement. If it doesn't, you can either make the assumption or make them sign a month-to-month lease agreement. But yeah, I think that comes down to what your ultimate goal is. If you want them out of there, then you have to give them a notice of non-renewal of their lease. And if you're just sort of indifferent, then let it expire, let it go month to month, and just don't renew it. All right, next question we have is from Teresa. So Teresa says, one of my rentals has an in-ground pool. What should I be including in the lease to protect myself as well as the tenant? So kind of going back to Susan's question about the trampoline, pools, trampoline, not fun for landlords. All things that are fun are usually Susan, I'm pretty sure we don't have, but a pool addendum, I'm pretty sure we do. You may be able to use the pool now. I'm pretty sure that we have the website, or Susan, if you guys place one and copy paste and put trampoline and make sure that they're at least, it's at least another layer to release you from any liability in the event that something happens. So you want to make sure, obviously you need to be following code. So, whether if it's an in-ground pool, I know in my area you have to have proper fencing, those type of things. Being that it's a rental, you may even be required to put up signage that says, children must be supervised in the pool, those type of things. But yeah, for sure, at the very least, you want to put an addendum in place. I'm trying to see here what that addendum. Yeah, you can get it for free on the RentPrep website. Double check with your. So I would definitely make sure you put that in place. If there's anything that the tenant can do to relieve or release a little bit of liability from you there, whether it be renter's insurance, that they have to carry a policy that mentions the pool in there specifically. So sometimes that might come, might be good advice from your own insurance company, because they obviously want to protect you as well. So I feel like that's a pretty good question or a good conversation to have with your insurance agent. And at the very least, you want to make sure that you've got an addendum in place that relieves you from at least a little bit of liability should something ever happen. Okay. So I hope that answers your question, Teresa. I would definitely make sure if you've got somebody in place already, then you want to add that as an addendum immediately. If you haven't rented it yet, make sure you're including that as an addendum to the original lease agreement as well. All right, so I got a question here from Gary. So Gary asked, for new tenants, how do you handle the contract signing? Do you email the contract to the tenant for them to look over prior to signing and meet them to sign, go over each detail on every page in person with them? So kind of goes back to the, sorry, I forget the name, but I mentioned earlier in a comment that I think it's a good idea to go over the lease agreement. If for nothing else, they don't think that you're asleep at the wheel. If you're dealing with a situation like or whatever, let's say in your lease agreement that you say no smoking. So as you're going through the lease agreement and you're telling them, okay, you're agreeing here that there's no smoking, and then you might want to tell them like what would happen or how you might potentially stumble upon them smoking, so you might say, like, as we come through here and do inspections, we'll notice if you're smoking, and that would be an issue. So again, I feel like it's worth it to go over the lease agreement so that the person knows what they're signing. Now, you don't want to make it to the point where you're trying to scare them off necessarily either, but you want to make sure that they're aware that you know what's in the lease agreement, and you want to make sure that they know what's in the lease agreement. So I don't think that's a bad idea. A lot of people use digital lease agreements. I don't. And if I did have one in place, I might accept a digital signature, but I'd still want to review the agreement with the person. I feel like that's an important step. So for me personally, I like to go through it with them. If they want time to look it over, I have no issues with that. As long as I get a little bit of time to go through it with them. So what I don't want to do is say, here, hang on to it for 2 days, sign it, send it back to me, and then we're not even gonna have a conversation about it. That's what I would specifically avoid. I would say look over it for 2 days, or if you need, a couple of days to look through it, fine. On this day, this time, on through the lease agreement real quick, and take a little time to go through it with them. I feel like that's a good, easy step to reduce some risk of having some bad tenants in place. So that's my personal opinion on that. So I hope that helps you out, Gary. Okay. Question from Linda. How do you go about elderly tenant who will reside with other adult tenants? Do you run a credit, background, and income verification on the elderly tenant as well? So, I would say this seems like one of those two-way streets where, again, like discrimination can sort of be seen on a spectrum, right? Like you got to be careful going one way or the other. Age discrimination probably, again, on that same spectrum. Like you can't, I guess the thing to remember is you can't impose rules for some and not others. So whatever, everything that you do has to be consistent and it has to be fair. So the right answer here is all occupants should be screened, period. All occupants should be screened. An occupant, well, I'll specify, all occupants over the age of 18 should be screened. Obviously, you can't do a credit and background check on somebody under the age of 18. So children, they get the exemption, but if it's adults, even if it's husband and wife, don't cut a corner and run a background check on just one or the other, because A, you don't know how long they've been married. B, most evictions that we see when they're filed are filed under one person's name and not both. And we've also seen a lot of people play this game where, the wife puts the lease in her name, gets the eviction, they move out. Now it's the husband's turn. Because if the husband's going through the screening, that eviction's not going to show up if that landlord's only running the screening on him. So my rule of thumb, every occupant over the age of 18 should be screened, and that will, if you didn't do something for one that you did for these, relieve you from any possible future liability. It's so good to make them go through that same process. They worthy, or maybe they have stuff, but it's from, they may not have credit, they may not have anything. No, consider all. If they're going to be pitching in and paying, run credit, background, income verification, even if that's just me personally. But I wouldn't exclude them as an elderly tenant. So I hope that helps answer the question for you, Linda. Okay. I think that is about it. Looks like Bill chimed in and says that he uses Evolve for his short-term rentals. They do a great job for him. So great share there, Bill. Appreciate that. I've never heard of Evolve. No, I don't think I have heard of Evolve. Or I had something in mind, but I'm not sure if it's the same one. So I would, again, it's never a bad idea to use the community as a good crowd source as well. We see so many great interactions with landlords on here. Hey, have you dealt with this situation before? Or hey, anybody have any good suggestions for short-term rentals? Crowdsourcing it that way through the community is always a great way to find out what everyone's doing, and don't always take everything at face value. Still do a little bit of your own digging, but sometimes it's a good crowdsourcing way to just say, hey, I wonder what everyone's doing and what's working for them, and maybe what to avoid. So good on you, Bill, there for sharing. So thank you everybody again for chiming in and submitting some questions for me. I appreciate it, and I appreciate anybody that watches it live or watches the replay, and I appreciate everybody involved in our community and making it what it is. Really, it's your community. We have our name on it and we built it, but we built it for landlords, and you know, we try to do some things like this where we're adding some value, but you know, we try our best to keep the streets clean and make it a safe place for landlords to connect with other landlords, and I believe that that's exactly what it's become. So appreciate everybody who engages in the community and really makes it what it is. So thank you again, everybody, and see you next time.